Before COVID-19, travel and tourism had become one of the most important sectors in the world economy, accounting for 10% of the global GDP and more than 320 million jobs worldwide. However, as the pandemic began, countries rapidly closed their borders, and the tourism sector experienced a massive loss as international travel collapsed. For this project, I looked at Scandinavian countries because they are strong economies that are not tourism dependent yet still experience dramatic effects of COVID-19 on their tourism industry. The economies of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden are among the world's wealthiest, and their inhabitants enjoy some of the highest standards of living in the world due to relatively small wage gaps, high employment, and high taxation combined with accessible education and social security. Scandinavia is located in northern Europe and consists of the countries Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Also often included in Scandinavia are Finland, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland, based on their geologic, linguistic, and economic relations with Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Tourism is defined as a social, cultural, and economic phenomenon which entails the movement of people to countries or places outside their usual environment for personal or business purposes. Further, people who partake in tourism are visitors, and tourism has to do with their activities, some of which involve tourism expenditure. Tourism plays a strategically important role in the economy because it affects the GDP levels through the creation of new jobs and an increase in the demand for goods and services for the local population. Before the break of COVID-19, Scandinavian countries were experiencing rapid growth in the tourism sector. However, there was a dramatic decrease in tourism sector revenue due to national and international travel restrictions, with some countries having experienced losses of up to 80% of pre-pandemic revenue. The blow to the tourism industry was rough, with demand for inbound tourism paralyzing the industry for a long time. Regional airlines such as Scandinavian Airlines and Norwegian Air Shuttle struggled financially to stay in the air. In July 2022, Scandinavian Airlines filed for bankruptcy protection and continued to experience turbulence in the following months. Many of these tourism-based businesses, like airlines and hotels, struggled financially and were required to rethink their entire business models. The hospitality scene in Sweden was unique because the decline in bookings was not as dramatic of a decline compared to other European countries like Spain or Italy. Instead, it was a gradual decline, with occupancy being filled by domestic tourists. One reason for this is that Sweden stood alone in Europe with its light touch approach to tackling the coronavirus crisis. But after receiving heavy criticism for this approach, in December 2020, Swedish leaders announced new and tougher restrictions and recommendations, including face masks in public transportation and closing all non-essential public services. One issue that hit Sweden the hardest was the travel restrictions from Norway. Despite lifting restrictions for much of Europe, the Norwegian government kept a mandatory 10-day home quarantine in place for anyone entering the country from Sweden. This has effectively ruled out most tourism from Sweden's biggest foreign tourists for more than 4 months. Border towns such as Strömstad, whose economy relies heavily on Norwegian visitors, have been the hardest hit. The town's mayor explained that when Norway closed its border, Strömstad went overnight from full activity to total stillness. Conversely, Denmark's approach to dealing with the coronavirus pandemic can be summarized by saying, act fast and act with force. By acting quickly and effectively early on, Denmark was able to ease up on travel restrictions much earlier than other countries. When travel restrictions loosened in Denmark, there was also an increased preference of people for domestic tourism during the COVID-19 pandemic. This might be attributed to the concept of risk assessment, as the choice of traveling in their own country may have seemed safer and presented less threat than taking the risk and the inconvenience of traveling abroad. Further, some believe that in the future, tourism in Denmark will shift to focus more on outdoor activities during high seasons and more on the sustainable aspect of the country. Iceland is the Scandinavian country whose tourism sector was most detrimentally affected by COVID-19. During the pandemic, Iceland was particularly at risk of a tourism industry crash because of the island's geographic isolation, small domestic population, strict border measures, and an economy dependent on international tourists. As travel restrictions were implemented across the world, foreign arrivals to Iceland dropped about 75% in 2020, after an already low level of inbound flights in 2019. To combat the inevitable economic consequences of the pandemic on the tourism industry, the government invested over $12 million in tourism infrastructure and $9 million in a program that encouraged domestic travel. These investments were intended to be short-term solutions to keep the tourism industry and economy afloat. In 2021, the OECD explained that further diversifying the economy and pursuing structural reforms to boost productivity growth will be key to building a strong and sustainable recovery. And a full recovery of the tourism sector hinges on health and economic conditions overseas, enabling the return of foreign visitors. In 2022, 2 years into the pandemic, tourism measures like international hotel stays were still down 21% from 2019, demonstrating that COVID-19 profoundly impacted Scandinavian tourism. Some experts even find the idea of the tourism industry returning to the pre-pandemic normal nearly impossible due to the widespread impacts. Factors like job insecurity, high unemployment rates, and reduced savings will lead to tourism being classified as a luxury spend and ultimately suffering.